John Harper sat in his worn leather armchair, the soft crackling of the fire barely enough to cut through the thick silence of the house. The rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece reminded him that it was getting late. The house felt emptier than usual with his family gone. His wife, Sarah, had taken the kids to visit her parents in the next state over. It was just him now, alone in their country home, with no neighbors for miles. He normally relished the quiet of the country, but tonight was different. The isolation weighed heavily on him. He took a sip from the glass of bourbon in his hand, his mind wandering to the unsettling events of the past few days. He had heard the stories, everyone had. Black-eyed children. A myth, a legend, but one so pervasive it had wormed its way into even the most skeptical corners of his mind. He had always dismissed the tales as just another urban legend until a few nights ago when they first appeared. It had been just after sundown, the sky bruised with purples and oranges, when he heard the knock. It was strange, out here in the middle of nowhere, where no one ever showed up unannounced. He had approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Two children stood on the porch, a boy and a girl, no older than 10, staring blankly at the door.
"Can we come in?"
the girl had asked, her voice eerily flat, almost robotic. John felt a chill crawl up his spine as he gazed through the peephole. Their eyes. They were black, completely black, not just the pupils. There were no whites to their eyes, only inky voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. His hand froze on the doorknob. He remembered the stories. The folklore said that once you let them in, something terrible would happen. The black-eyed children were a harbinger of doom, a malevolent force in the guise of innocence. They could only come inside if you invited them, and once inside, they would bring chaos and destruction. He had backed away from the door, his heart pounding in his chest. "No," he whispered, "you can't come in." For several minutes, the children had remained on the porch, their dark eyes staring unblinking at the door. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, they turned and walked back into the dark woods that bordered his property. That had been 3 nights ago. Every night since, they had returned, always just after sunset, always asking to come in. Every night he refused, his heart racing as he watched them leave, always wondering what would happen if he ever gave in to their request. Tonight was no different. The firelight cast flickering shadows around the room, but the warmth it provided did nothing to dispel the cold knot of fear that had settled in his gut. He knew it was only a matter of time before they knocked again. As if on cue, there it was, a soft, almost polite knock at the front door. His breath caught in his throat. He placed the glass down and stood up, the weight of dread settling over him. Slowly, he approached the door, his footsteps muffled by the thick rug beneath him. Through the peephole, he saw them, the same boy and girl. They stood there in the fading twilight, their faces pale and their eyes. Those black, empty eyes that seemed to see straight through him.
"Can we come in?"
the boy asked this time, his voice just as flat and devoid of emotion as the girl's had been. John's hand shook as it rested on the doorframe. "No," he said firmly, his voice hoarse, "you can't come in." The children didn't move. They stood there for what felt like hours, staring, waiting. John felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He didn't know how long he could keep this up. Every night, they grew more persistent, their silent presence gnawing at his sanity. He turned away from the door, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. When he looked back through the peephole, they were gone. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. They would be back tomorrow night. He was sure of it. John collapsed into his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't tell Sarah about this. She wouldn't believe him. Hell, he wouldn't have believed it a week ago. But the black-eyed children were real. They were coming for him, and he had no idea why. The night passed in a haze of anxiety and fitful sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made him jump. When the morning light finally filtered through the curtains, it felt like a reprieve, but he knew it was only temporary. For the next few days, the routine repeated itself. The knocks. The requests. The cold terror. The children never stopped coming. John felt like he was living in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. Then, one evening, something changed. He had gone into town for supplies, bourbon mostly, as he found himself needing it more and more. When he returned, he noticed something strange. Sarah's car was in the driveway. His stomach twisted. She wasn't supposed to be back for another few days. As he pulled up to the house, he felt an overwhelming sense of unease. He stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the property. Everything seemed normal, but something was off. He could feel it. He opened the front door and called out, "Sarah, kids?" From the kitchen, Sarah appeared, a surprised look on her face.
"John, you're home early,"
she said with a smile.
"We decided to come back a few days early. The kids were missing home."
John forced a smile, but his heart was pounding. "I wasn't expecting you," he said, his voice tight. "Where are the kids?"
"Upstairs, I think. They were playing in their rooms,"
Sarah replied, turning back to the stove where she was preparing dinner. John felt a wave of dread wash over him. The black-eyed children. What if they had been here while he was gone? He rushed upstairs, taking the steps two at a time. His youngest daughter, Lily, was sitting on her bed, coloring in her sketchbook. She looked up as he entered.
"Hey, Daddy,"
she said cheerfully. John tried to keep his voice calm. "Lily, did anyone come to the door while I was gone?" Lily's face brightened, and John's heart sank.
"Yeah, 2 kids. They said they were friends of yours, Daddy. They wanted to come in and play, so I let them in."
The words hit him like a physical blow. His blood ran cold, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. You let them in?" Lily nodded innocently.
"They were really nice. They're in the living room now."
John felt a rush of panic. His mind raced as he turned and ran down the stairs. The living room was empty. He looked around frantically, his heart hammering in his chest. Where were they? "Sarah!" he called out, his voice cracking with fear. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, concern etched on her face.
"What's wrong, John?"
"Did you see them?" he asked breathlessly. "The children? The ones Lily let in?" Sarah frowned.
"John, what are you talking about? No one came in."
A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Lily said she let them in. The black-eyed children. "They're here, somewhere." Sarah's face softened with concern.
"John, I think you need to sit down. Maybe you've been stressed with us gone."
"I'm not crazy," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "They're real. They've been coming to the door every night, and now they're inside." Sarah took a step back, her eyes wide with shock. John turned, scanning the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew they were here. He could feel their presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A dark figure standing at the edge of the living room, just out of sight. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head. There they were. The 2 children stood side by side, their black eyes gleaming in the dim light. They stared at him, unblinking, their expressions unreadable. "Thank you for letting us in," the girl said, her voice cold and empty. John's mouth went dry. His worst fear had come true. Sarah turned to look at the children, her face pale.
Who are they?"
she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're not children," John said, his voice low and full of dread. "They're something else. Something dangerous." The boy and girl took a step forward, their black eyes locked on John. "We've come to stay," the boy said, his voice echoing in the silent room. John felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had no idea what would happen now that they were inside, but he knew it wasn't good. The children smiled, a cold, joyless smile that sent a shiver down John's spine. "We'll be here," the girl said softly, "forever." That night, John barely slept. He could feel the presence of the black-eyed children in the house, even though he couldn't see them. They were always just out of sight, watching, waiting. Sarah, still shaken by what she had seen, refused to talk about it. She didn't understand, but she couldn't deny what she had witnessed. Over the following days, strange things began to happen. The lights would flicker, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The temperature in the house would drop suddenly, even though it was still summer. And always, John felt eyes on him, those dark, soulless eyes. The children never spoke again. But they were always there, their silent presence a constant reminder of the terrible mistake that had been made. No one else could see them, not Sarah, not the kids, only John. It was as if they had come just for him, to torment him for the rest of his life. And no matter how hard he tried, there was no escaping them.